John Ruskin, the great 19th century British art and social critic, is one of my intellectual heroes, so I can't resist organizing what I have to say today around one of Ruskin's most famous remarks from the final volume of his first masterpiece, Modern Painters. The greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds of people can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. To see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion, all in one. In my own field, journalism, the insight that to observe and report involves far more than the mere ordering of data is a perennial challenge and a perennial reminder. As Ruskin implies, while looking may come naturally, seeing is something else. The eye with its intellectual lens and moral retina, learning not only to register, but to perceive, and further in Ruskin's view, to love, to embrace what it perceives. It's not for nothing that healing the blind is one of the most emblematic of Jesus' miracles. In removing the barrier to physical sight, the Lord simultaneously lifts the veil on the redemptive vision of God, a transformation of perspective that involves an often complete upending of conventional points of view, what might usefully be called the conventions of sight. We have only to think of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, among so many other examples. You remember the story. The rich man living in comfort and plenty, Lazarus, the invisible beggar at the gate. In eternity, their positions are reversed. Lazarus enjoying the communion of heaven, the rich man languishing in the isolation and helplessness of hell. The conventions of sight in any age would have the rich man occupying center stage. His comings and goings, his glamorous lifestyle, the family melodrama, the simmering battles over the inheritance. But in fact, the real story was Lazarus, the beggar at the gate. A detail so easily missed that only a redeemed sense of perspective would spot it. It's safe to say that I've had an odd career as a journalist, one I don't think I could possibly have planned and for which I certainly couldn't have been prepared. The best way I could describe my professional trajectory, such as it is that it has always been, and at every stage, an improvisation. One of the things that made it odd from the perspective of standard reporting and the object of some curiosity from my secular colleagues was that I was a Catholic journalist. I can remember any number of times after I got to know a secular journalist friend of mine or colleague, I would get the question, "What exactly do you do?" And as a Catholic journalist, one who was not only covering church news as such, but writing about international politics and culture from the always remarkable perch of church institutions, embattled Christian communities, and war zone apostolates. There's nothing like seeing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from the vantage point of a pediatric clinic in the old city of Jerusalem that employed Jewish and Christian medical personnel to serve mostly Muslim poor as the first Intifada raged. Or the Balkan War from the back seat of a van belonging to a high-risk Catholic medical foundation carrying supplies to makeshift clinics on the front lines of all sides in the conflict. One of the most remarkable and unexpected chapters in my life as a journalist came a few years after I'd returned to the States from covering the Bosnian War. More than a little worse for wear, I'm afraid. I told my editors that after intifadas and civil wars, I hoped that nobody minded if I set out the next few revolutions. A year later, I received a call from a friend in DC that an exiled Sudanese bishop was eager to tell his story and that I was just the man for the job. Though more than a little wary, I nevertheless agreed to do the transcontinental interview. The bishop, Makram Max Kassis of El Obeid Diocese in Central Sudan, told a compelling tale of the genocidal campaign against the isolated Nuba people in his diocese at the hands of the Khartoum government and his almost single-handed determination, government blockades and embargoes notwithstanding, to provide priests, medical help, parishes, and schools for his people, even under near impossible wartime conditions. "You must come with me," he told me. "People think it's too risky. We fly in illegally from Kenya, you know. But then that won't bother you. You've had war experience." Much to my relief, I didn't hear back. In fact, I'd more or less forgotten all about it until a year later I get this call from Nairobi, "Gabriel, we're leaving for the Nuba Mountains in 3 weeks. When do you arrive?" Perhaps the best and most efficient way I could summarize my years with the Nuba is by telling the story of my first encounter with a rebel militia leader. Again, for efficiency's sake, I'm reading from my book, War and Faith in Sudan. Quote, "I have always believed that it is one of the functions of journalism to bring to light what is hidden, to tell not the story that everyone is telling, but the story that no one is, to seek out the invisible realities that all too often can't be seen from our customary vantage points and with our typical points of reference, victimizations that fall through the cracks, the very invisibility of which give their perpetrators a free hand." That was my first reason for going to the remote Nuba Mountains of Central Sudan, where a military junta had been conducting a ruthless war of liquidation against the civilian population for years with impunity. The second reason for going, or rather for going back, had to do with something that I heard there. It was, I think, my first interview as it happened with the commander of the insurgent forces of the Sudan People's Liberation Army in the Nuba Mountains. I knew that the SPLA's war against government troops in the region had bogged down, and I had been told that they were looking for more sophisticated weapon systems to fight the reign of terror from Khartoum's bombers, Stinger missiles, for example, from discreet US suppliers. I asked the young commander a question that I thought might launch us into that discussion. "So, what's the most important thing your soldiers need out here in the Nuba Mountains?" I said, getting my notebook out. "The most important thing?" he asked back through translators. "The most important thing my soldiers need," he said, "is to learn to fight and not to hate." I looked up. It was the last thing I had expected to hear. "Fight the enemy if you must," he went on, "but why catch his disease?" For good measure, he thought the Stinger missiles a splendid idea when I brought it up later. As I was to discover, the soldier's remark proved characteristic of a Nuba approach to struggle, and coupled with their history of tribal and religious tolerance, hinted at a far-sightedness that stood in stark contrast with much of Sudanese history and even with attitudes that I had found in other corners of the insurgency. It was more than far-sightedness, though. There was a spirituality hidden in the heart of Nuba experience, one sensed, a complex, double-edged ethos, both determined and generous, that had made such sagacity possible. "I will build my civilization," the late Nuba political leader Yusuf Kua once wrote of his aims, "and then I will forgive everyone who humiliated me." Far from a simple story about Khartoum's attempt to disperse the Nuba through famine and terror, what I discovered in my many months with the Nuba was another story altogether. It was a story that in the end had less to do with victimization, though that was clearly the case, with the ordeal these people were enduring, with the failures of the international community, or with American governmental inaction, the conventions of this sort of reportage. A hardened narrative, one should note, that, while accurate as far as it goes, tends to turn the actors in the drama into passive, even faceless sufferers, the would-be subjects of Western rescue. The real story, we discovered, had to do with the Nuba themselves, with the spiritual and psychological and cultural resources the Nuba brought to their struggle, with which they faced, managed, and defied the terrible crisis they were in. That made Nuba Catholics celebrate with dancing and drumming on the hills only hours after a Christmas bombing raid. That made Nuba Muslims walk for days to salute their Christian brothers and sisters on the feast of Easter, despite the fact that Khartoum waged its brutal war in the name of Islam. That made Nuba children demand that teachers return to classes the day after an aerial attack on a Bush school killed 20 students and a teacher who attempted to defend them. Bishop Cassis gave this quality, this spiritual poise, a name. He called it the hidden gift. The hidden gift, a mysterious grace, a wisdom which have been given to these isolated, invisible peoples by their history, by their suffering, by the one, as the bishop was wont to say, who had walked with them in their hills long before the missionaries came and taught them this steely serenity. A gift that one suspected was of far greater value than the assistance and support, however necessary, life-giving even, we were offering them. All of which brings us back, full circle, to John Ruskin and to seeing. The greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and to tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds of people can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. To see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion, all in one. A proper question, I think, for a day like today. What would it mean if we were to become souls that see? And what would our world look like, do you imagine, if our eyes were open? Thank you.